Kongdae-ho woke up to the sound of metal screaming and sparks flying everywhere. The escape pod shook like a leaf in a hurricane as it fell through the atmosphere of an unknown planet. His head pounded and blood dripped from a cut above his right eye. The safety straps dug into his chest as the pod spun out of control 3 days ago. His life had been simple. He was just a cargo pilot flying supplies from Earth to Mars colony, the same boring route he had done 100 times before, but then his ship, the Lucky Dragon, had exploded without warning. One moment he was drinking coffee and watching the stars, the next moment he was scrambling into the emergency pod as flames ate through the hull. Now he was crashing on some alien world millions of miles from home. The pod computer kept beeping warnings in Korean and English: oxygen, low fuel, empty, navigation systems offline. Everything was broken. The small window showed purple sand and silver trees rushing up to meet him. The impact threw Dae-ho against the wall so hard he saw stars. His ribs felt like someone had kicked them with steel boots. The pod bounced twice, then rolled down a hill before finally stopping upside down. Smoke filled the cramped space, making him cough, and his eyes water. He hung there for a moment, catching his breath and checking if anything was broken. His left arm hurt, but still moved. His legs were okay. The translator device on his belt was cracked, but still working. The emergency kit had scattered across the ceiling, which was now the floor. Dae-ho pressed the emergency release, and the pod door hissed open. Fresh air rushed in, carrying strange smells like copper pennies and burning plastic. He crawled out on his hands and knees, then stood up. Slowly, everything hurt, but he was alive. The alien world stretched out before him like something from a dream. The sky was pale green, with 2 small suns hanging like yellow eyes. The sand under his feet was deep purple and felt soft like powder. Strange trees grew everywhere, with leaves that looked like they were made of silver metal. When the wind blew through them, they made musical sounds like tiny bells. In the distance, he could see massive towers made of black stone. They rose from the ground like the fingers of some buried giant. Each tower was easily 1,000 feet tall and covered with glowing symbols that pulsed like heartbeats. Between the towers, he could see movement, tiny dots that might be vehicles or creatures. Dae-ho opened his emergency kit and took inventory. 1 water recycler, good for maybe 3 days. 2 food packs that tasted like cardboard but would keep him alive. A basic medical kit with bandages and pain pills, a flare gun with 6 shots, a small knife that his father had given him, a photo of his wife Yoon-jin and daughter Min-ha smiling at the camera. He looked at the photo and felt his chest tighten with worry. Yoon-jin would be expecting him home in 5 days. She was making his favorite soup. For his birthday, Min-ha had been practicing a song on her violin to surprise him. They had no idea he was stranded on an alien world with almost no supplies. The pod was completely dead. No power, no communications, no hope of calling for help. The navigation computer showed nothing but static. Even if a rescue ship came looking, they would never find him here. The galaxy was too big, and he was too small. Dae-ho bandaged his head wound and checked his ribs. They were bruised, but not broken. He put on his jacket and shouldered the emergency pack. The towers were his only hope. If there was intelligent life on this planet, that was where he would find it. As he started walking toward the towers, he tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong. The atmosphere seemed breathable, but it might be slowly poisoning him. The gravity felt normal, but the radiation from those 2 suns might be cooking his cells. The alien creatures he had glimpsed might be predators that saw him as easy prey. The purple sand made walking difficult. It was deep and soft, and his boots sank in with every step. Soon his legs were burning with effort, and sweat was running down his back. The silver trees provided some shade, but the air under them felt thick and humid, like breathing soup. After an hour of walking, Dae-ho stopped to rest and drink water. The towers looked closer, but still impossibly far away. He was already tired, and he had barely started the journey. At this rate, it would take him all day to reach them, if he could make it at all. That was when he noticed the eyes watching him from the metallic forest. At first he thought it was just his imagination. The cut on his head was making him dizzy, and he had not eaten in almost a day, but then he saw them clearly, multiple pairs of yellow glowing eyes peering at him from behind the silver trees. They were too big to be animal eyes, and they moved with intelligence. Dae-ho stood up slowly and put his hand on the knife. His father had taught him some basic martial arts when he was young, but that was 20 years ago. He was a pilot, not a warrior. His greatest skill was flying cargo ships in straight lines. The eyes followed him as he resumed walking toward the towers. Sometimes he would catch glimpses of massive shapes moving parallel to his path, always staying just out of clear sight. They were big, much bigger than humans, and they moved with purpose like hunters tracking prey. His mouth went dry and his heart started beating faster. Every survival instinct he had was screaming at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The pod was destroyed behind him. The towers were still hours away ahead of him, and the alien forest stretched out on both sides. He was trapped in the open with unknown predators circling him. Deho forced himself to keep walking at a steady pace. If he ran, they might chase him, and he was already tired. If he stopped, they might decide he was weak enough to attack. His only chance was to keep moving toward the towers and hope that whoever built them was friendly. The two suns climbed higher in the green sky, and the heat became unbearable. Sweat soaked his clothes, and his water supply was running low. The purple sand seemed to go on forever, and his legs felt like lead weights. Every step was agony, but he kept moving. Behind him, the eyes continued to watch and follow. They were patient like cats stalking a mouse. They seemed to know that he was getting weaker with every mile, that his strength was failing and his hope was fading. They were waiting for the right moment to strike. Deho thought about his family again. Yunjin would be at work now teaching mathematics to her students. She always worried when he was away on long flights, but she never complained. She knew he was doing important work, keeping the colony supplied with everything they needed. Minha would be at school learning about Earth history and practicing her violin. She was only 12, but already smarter than most adults. She wanted to be a scientist when she grew up, maybe even work on one of the research stations near Jupiter. They were depending on him to come home. They needed him to survive whatever was going to happen on this strange world. He could not give up. No matter how hopeless things looked, he had to find a way to get back to them. The towers grew larger as the day wore on, and Deho could see more details. The black stone was covered with carvings that seemed to move when he was not looking directly at them. The glowing symbols pulsed in patterns like some kind of code or language. Around the base of the towers he could see structures that looked like buildings. Streets and vehicles moved between them. This was definitely a city built by intelligent beings. The question was whether they would help a lost human or see him as a threat. As the first sun began to set, the eyes in the forest grew bolder. They came closer to the edge of the trees, and Deho could see parts of the creatures that owned them, scales that changed color like oil on water, massive clawed hands that could crush his skull like an egg, teeth that gleamed like knives in the fading light. He was almost at the city now, just a few more miles, but his strength was almost gone, and the predators knew it. They were getting ready to make their move. The alien hunters struck just as Deho reached the outer walls of the tower city. They moved like liquid lightning bursting from the silver forest in perfect formation. These were not wild beasts, but trained soldiers. Their scales shifted from forest green to deep red as they surrounded him on all sides. Deho spun around looking for an escape route, but there was nowhere to run. The aliens stood 9 feet tall with 4 arms, each ending in clawed hands. Their heads were elongated like crocodiles, but with intelligent yellow eyes that burned with cold fire. They wore armor made from the same black stone as the towers and carried weapons that hummed with deadly energy. The leader stepped forward and spoke in a voice like grinding rocks. The translator on Deho's belt crackled to life, turning the alien words into broken English. I am Commander Vextar of the Thakuri warrior caste. You are trespassing on our sacred training world. Little Mamaldeho raised his hands to show he was not armed. I'm sorry for the intrusion, he said. My ship was destroyed and I crashed here by accident. I mean no harm, I just want to find a way home. The other Thakuri warriors laughed with sounds like breaking glass. Vextar tilted his massive head and studied the human with obvious amusement. Another soft creature from the plague species, he said. Humans spread through space like disease. But here you will learn your proper place. 2 warriors grabbed Deho by the arms, lifting him off the ground like he weighed nothing. Their claws dug into his jacket but did not pierce his skin yet. They were being careful not to damage their new toy. The translator picked up their whispered conversations about how long this one might last in the arena. They carried him through massive gates into the city of Kethmoran. The architecture was unlike anything on Earth. Everything was built from that same black stone, but it seemed to pulse with inner light. The buildings were carved directly from the living rock of the mountains, creating a maze of tunnels and chambers that stretched deep underground. Thousands of Thakori filled the streets, all of them warriors from across the galaxy. They wore different colored armor marking their home worlds and battle achievements. Some had scars that told stories of great victories, others carried trophies from defeated enemies. The air rang with the sound of weapons being sharpened and warriors boasting about their kills. In the center of the city rose the great arena carved from a natural crater in the mountainside. Stone seats climbed the walls in endless tiers, holding 50,000 spectators. The arena floor was stained dark with old blood and covered in sand that had drunk the life from countless challengers. Vextar gestured toward the arena with obvious pride. For 300 years no outsider has defeated a Thakori champion, he said. We are the greatest fighters in the known galaxy. Species come from across space to test themselves against us. All of them fail, all of them die. The warriors dragged Deho down into the holding cells beneath the arena. The corridors were carved from solid rock and lined with cages holding prisoners from dozens of different worlds. Some looked almost human, while others were so alien he could not understand their basic shape. All of them had the same look in their eyes, defeat and despair. They threw him into a cell with 3 other prisoners. A blue-skinned woman with gills on her neck looked up as he entered. Her translator identified her as Young from the Kepler colonies. Her voice was soft and sad, like someone who had given up hope. You are human, she said. I have heard of your species. The Thakori find you amusing because you look so weak and helpless. They will make you fight their champions for the entertainment of the crowds. A reptilian creature in the corner hissed agreement. Its translator was broken, but it managed to communicate through gestures and broken words, pointing to scars across its body and shaking its head. Sadly, the 3rd prisoner was unconscious, curled in a corner with bandages covering most of its form. Deho sat down on the cold stone floor and looked around the cell. The walls were smooth and unbreakable. The door was solid metal with no visible lock or handle. Even if he could get out, the corridors were full of guards and the city was full of warriors. There was no escape. How long have you been here? He asked. Young counted on her fingers. 2 months, maybe 3 times. Moves strangely in this place. The Thakori feed us just enough to keep us alive and strong enough to put on a good show. They want their audiences to see real fights, not executions. What happens to those who lose? Young pointed to stains on the arena floor visible through the small window in their cell door. The sand drinks their blood and the crowds cheer for more violence. The Thakori believe that defeating weaker species proves their superiority. They have built their entire culture around this idea. The reptilian prisoner made more gestures indicating that some fighters lasted longer than others by running and hiding, but eventually the Thakori champions always won. The arena was designed to give nowhere to hide, and the champions were too fast and strong for any normal being to defeat. That night, Deho lay on the hard floor staring at the ceiling and thinking about his family. Somewhere across the galaxy, Yunjin was probably filing a missing person report with the Space Patrol. Minha was probably practicing her violin and wondering why Daddy had not called like he always did. The other prisoners slept fitfully, making sounds of pain and fear in their dreams. Young talked in her sleep, calling out names in her native language. The reptilian creature kept scratching at old wounds that would not heal. The unconscious prisoner barely seemed to be breathing. Deho closed his eyes and tried to remember his father's voice. The old man had died 5 years ago, but his lessons still echoed in Deho's memory. Son, he used to say, size and strength are not everything. The greatest warriors know that true power comes from understanding balance, timing, and using your opponent's force against them. The ancient martial arts his father had taught him seemed useless here. What good were judo throws and pressure points against 9-foot-tall aliens with 4 arms and natural armor? But something in the back of his mind kept whispering that there might be a way to survive this if he could just remember everything his father had tried to teach him. Outside the cell, the sounds of the city continued through the night. Warriors training in the courtyards, weapons being forged in underground furnaces, crowds gathering for tomorrow's entertainment. The Thakori never slept. Their culture was built around constant Preparation for battle. In the morning, the guards would come to select the next fighter. The other prisoners had told him that new arrivals were always chosen first while they were still fresh and could put on the best show for the audience. Daeho had maybe 12 hours before they dragged him into the arena to face a champion who had never lost a single fight. He thought about Yunjin's smile and Minha's laugh and promised himself that somehow he would find a way to see them again. Even if it seemed impossible, even if no one had ever escaped from Kethmaran, he would not give up. He would fight with everything he had, and maybe that would be enough. The morning horn sounded like thunder rolling through the mountain, causing the entire city to vibrate. Guards in black armor marched down the corridor toward the holding cells, their boots echoing off stone walls like hammers striking anvils. Daeho sat up, knowing his time had come. The other prisoners looked at him with pity and fear. Commander Vexstar himself came to collect the new human fighter. His scales had shifted to bright gold, a sign of excitement among his people. Today we have special entertainment for the masses, he announced. A human who thinks he can survive on our sacred world. Show us your species' famous determination before you die. Two guards grabbed Daeho and hauled him up toward the arena floor. The corridors grew brighter as they climbed, filled with the roar of 50,000 Thakuri spectators hungry for blood. The sound was like standing inside a waterfall mixed with the screaming of hunting hawks. When they reached the arena entrance, Daeho could see the full scope of the ancient battlefield. The floor was covered in purple sand that sparkled with flecks of metal, creating patterns that seemed to move in the light. Stone seats rose in endless tiers carved directly from the living mountain. Each seat held a warrior eager to see fresh violence. Vexstar gestured toward the crowd with obvious pride. These are the greatest fighters from across our empire, he said. They have traveled from 100 worlds to witness combat in the sacred arena. Some have waited years for the honor of watching our champions destroy their enemies. The gates opened with the grinding sound of massive stone wheels. Daeho was pushed forward into the bright arena light. The two suns hung overhead like angry eyes, turning the air shimmer with heat. The crowd roared approval as he stumbled onto the blood-stained sand. He looked tiny, standing alone in the center of the vast space. His torn clothes and bandaged wounds made him appear even more helpless. The Thakuri pointed and laughed, making jokes about how quickly this one would fall. Some threw pieces of rotted fruit that splattered around his feet. Vexstar raised his forearms for silence. When 50,000 warriors stopped shouting at once, the quiet was almost more terrifying than the noise. Today, this human will face Grothak, the undefeated, our greatest champion, who has never lost a single combat in 20 years of glorious battle. Opposite gates began to open with sounds like earthquake. The crowd went wild, chanting a name over and over in their harsh language, Grothak, Grothak. The sound built into a rhythm that made the very air pulse with energy. Out of the shadows stepped the champion, and Daeho felt his heart nearly stop. Grothak stood 12 feet tall with muscles like steel cables wrapped around iron bones. His scales were deep black with silver patterns that marked him as a master warrior. Four arms ending in claws that could tear through metal armor. Scars covered his body like a roadmap of violence. Each mark told the story of a battle won and an enemy destroyed. His head was larger than Daeho's entire torso, with teeth like sword blades and eyes that burned with the cold fire of a predator who had never known defeat. In his four hands, Grothak carried weapons that hummed with deadly energy. A sword that crackled with electricity, a mace with spikes that dripped poison, a net made from razor wire, a shield covered in barbs that could slice a man in half. The crowd screamed approval at the sight of their hero. Daeho had no weapons, no armor, nothing but the torn clothes on his back and the small knife his father had given him. Years ago, he looked like an insect facing a dragon. The betting pools around the arena were not taking wagers on who would win, but on how long the human would last. Vexstar's voice boomed across the arena. Let the trial begin. May the strongest warrior claim victory, and may the weak learn their place in the natural order. Grothak raised his weapons and let out a roar that shook dust from the ceiling. The sound was like a landslide mixed with the scream of tearing metal. It was a challenge and a promise of death combined into one terrifying noise. The crowd fell silent, waiting for the show to begin. 50,000 pairs of eyes focused on the tiny human standing alone in the center of the killing ground. This was the moment they had all come to see, the moment when their champion would prove once again why the Thakuri were the masters of the Galaxy de Ho. Closed his eyes for just a second and heard his father's voice echoing across 20 years. Son, remember that every opponent has weaknesses. Even the strongest warrior can be defeated if you understand the principles of leverage, timing, and using their own force against them. When he opened his eyes again, something had changed. The fear was still there, but underneath it was something else. Something his father had tried to teach him, but he had never fully understood. Until this moment, the knowledge that sometimes the smallest fighter could topple the greatest giant if they fought smart instead of fighting. Hard Grothak began to move forward slowly, at first savoring the moment. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see how long this entertainment would last. The betting pools were closing with odds of 1,000 to 1 against the human lasting more than 30 seconds, but Deho was no longer thinking about the odds or the crowd or even his own death. He was remembering every lesson his father had ever taught him about balance and timing, and the ancient art of turning an enemy's strength into weakness. Every hour they had spent in the old garage practicing throws and holds and the subtle movements that could send a much larger opponent flying through the air. The champion raised his weapons, preparing to end this quickly and efficiently, just like he had ended every other fight for the past 20 years. He had no idea that he was about to face something no Thakuri warrior had ever encountered before, a human who remembered that his ancestors had survived by being smarter, not stronger than their enemies. Grothak charged across the arena like a runaway earthquake. His four arms moved in perfect coordination as he closed the distance in seconds. The crowd screamed with bloodlust, anticipating the moment when their champion would tear the small human apart. The sound was deafening, but Deho heard none of it. Time seemed to slow down as his mind focused on everything his father had taught him about fighting. The old man's voice echoed in his memory, clear as if he were standing right there. Do not try to match strength with strength, son. Use your opponent's power against them. Wait for the perfect moment, then act without hesitation. Grothak's massive feet pounded the sand, sending up clouds of purple dust. His weapons gleamed in the double sunlight, electricity crackling along the blade, poison dripping from the mace. The net whistled through the air as he prepared to capture and crush his prey in one devastating attack. The Thakuri champion had fought thousands of battles against warriors from across the galaxy. He had faced opponents with natural armor, opponents with multiple limbs, opponents with weapons that could slice through solid steel. None of them had lasted more than a few minutes against his overwhelming strength and speed, but he had never fought a human before, and he did not understand what 20,000 years of evolution as prey animals had built into their reflexes. Human ancestors had survived by outthinking predators that were bigger, faster, and stronger. They had learned to use tools and tactics that turned natural disadvantages into deadly advantages. Deho stood perfectly still, watching the champion approach. He looked relaxed, almost casual, as 12 feet of pure killing machine thundered toward him. The crowd assumed he was frozen with fear, paralyzed by the sight of certain death approaching. They had seen it before with other weak species at the last possible second. When Grothak's clawed fist was inches from his face, Deho moved. It was such a small movement that many in the crowd missed it entirely. Just a slight step to the left and a subtle shift of his shoulders. Nothing that should have mattered against such overwhelming force, but that tiny movement changed everything. Grothak's massive fist whistled past Deho's ear, missing by less than an inch. The champion's own momentum carried him forward, unable to stop or change direction. His perfectly coordinated attack suddenly became a liability as his own weight worked against him. In that split second of vulnerability, Deho acted with movements so smooth they seemed almost like dancing. He grabbed Grothak's extended wrist with both hands, dropped his center of gravity low, and used the ancient judo technique called Ipansoi Nage. The perfect shoulder throw physics took over where technique left off. Grothak's 12 feet of height and massive weight became weapons turned against him. The momentum he had built up charging across the arena could not be stopped or redirected. Instead of crushing the human, it lifted him into the air as Deho used leverage and timing to throw the champion over his shoulder. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the mighty Grothak flew through the air, arms windmilling helplessly as he realized what was happening. His weapons scattered across the sand as he tried desperately to regain control. But there was nothing he could do to stop the inevitable. He crashed into the arena wall with the sound of thunder. The black stone cracked from the impact, sending spiderweb fractures racing up the wall. Dust and debris rained down as the entire structure shook from the force of a 12-foot warrior. Hitting solid rock at full speed, the arena fell completely. Silent 50,000 Thakuri spectators sat in stunned disbelief, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Their invincible champion lay motionless against the wall, his massive body crumpled like a broken toy. Grothak the undefeated had been defeated by a creature one-third his size. Deho stood in the center of the arena, breathing hard but still upright. His clothes were torn and he was covered in purple dust, but he was alive. The champion who had never lost a single fight in 20 years was unconscious, possibly dead from the impact with the wall commander. Vexstar's jaw hung open, his yellow eyes wide with shock. In 3 centuries of arena combat, no challenger had ever defeated a Thakuri champion. The very idea was impossible. These soft, weak species were supposed to provide entertainment, not victories. The crowd began to murmur, then whisper, then talk in rising voices of confusion and fear. Some demanded another fight, claiming that this was trickery or luck. Others spoke in hushed tones about human magic or secret weapons. The betting pools were in chaos, as no one had imagined this outcome was even possible. Deho looked up at Vexstar and spoke through his translator. "I told you I meant no harm. I am just a cargo pilot who got lost. My wife is probably worried sick about me right now. I just want to go home to my family." The words seemed to break the spell of silence that had fallen over the arena. Suddenly everyone was talking at once. 50,000 voices raised in argument, confusion, and fear. The sound was like standing in the middle of a hurricane made of voices instead of wind. Medical teams rushed onto the arena floor to check on Grothak. He was alive but barely conscious, with several broken bones and a severe concussion. The greatest warrior in Thakuri history had been defeated by what they considered the weakest species in the galaxy. Vexstar stood up slowly, his scales shifting through colors that indicated deep thought and growing concern. Everything his people believed about strength and superiority had just been challenged by a small human using techniques they did not understand. If this ordinary cargo pilot could defeat their champion, what could human warriors accomplish? The implications were staggering. If humans were this dangerous individually, what could they do as a species? What other capabilities were they hiding behind their soft appearances and peaceful trade relationships? The Thakuri had always judged other races by obvious physical traits, but clearly they had missed something crucial about humanity. As medical teams carried Grothak away on a stretcher designed for his massive frame, Deho remained standing in the center of the arena, waiting to see what would happen next. He had survived the first challenge, but he was still a prisoner on an alien world with no way to get home. The great arena buzzed with voices like an enormous hive of angry insects. 50,000 Thakuri warriors argued among themselves, unable to accept what they had witnessed. Some shouted that the fight was invalid, demanding a rematch with fresh champions. Others whispered fearfully about human trickery and hidden powers that could defeat their greatest warrior commander. Vexstar raised his forearms, calling for silence, but it took several minutes for the crowd to quiet down. When they finally stopped talking, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a blade. Every eye in the arena focused on the small human standing calmly in the blood-stained sand. According to the ancient laws of Kethmer, and Vexstar announced, his voice carrying clearly through the stone amphitheater, "Any being who defeats our champion in single combat earns the right to speak before the assembled warriors. The human will be Hardeho." Stepped forward, his legs still shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. The throw had taken everything he had, and he was not sure he could do it again if they demanded another fight. But for now he was alive, and they were listening, which was more than he had dared hope for an hour ago. "I want you to understand something," he said, speaking clearly so the translator could relay his words to the crowd. "I am not a warrior. I have never been trained for combat. I am just a cargo pilot who flies supplies between Earth and the Mars colonies. The most dangerous thing I normally face is asteroid debris and shipping lanes." The crowd murmured with confusion. If this was not even a fighter, what did that say about human capabilities? Their entire understanding of strength and weakness was being challenged by concepts they had never considered before. What I just did to your champion, he continued, is something that children learn on my world. We teach it to kids as young as 6 years old for exercise and discipline. It is called judo, which means gentle way because it uses an opponent's strength against them instead of trying to match force with force. The murmuring grew louder as the implications sank in. This technique that had defeated their greatest warrior was considered basic training for human children. The betting pools had stopped taking wagers entirely as no one knew how to calculate odds anymore on Earth. We have millions of people who could do what I just did. Deho went on. Some of them are much better at it than me. My father taught me the basics 20 years ago, but I have not practiced seriously since I was a 3 days passed before the human rescue ship appeared in Kethmorn's purple sky, but they were the most extraordinary 3 days in Thakuri history. Commander Vexstar had ordered his warriors to treat Deho as an honored guest rather than a prisoner, and the cargo pilot found himself in the unique position of being the first human to experience Thakuri culture from the inside. The warrior city was unlike anything he had ever imagined. Every building was carved from living rock and designed for beings twice human size. The corridors echoed with the sounds of constant training as warriors from across the galaxy honed their skills in preparation for arena combat. But now they watched the small human with new eyes full of curiosity and cautious respect. Deho spent hours each day answering questions about Earth and human civilization. The Thakuri were fascinated by concepts they had never encountered before. The idea that a species could choose cooperation over competition, that they could build cities focused on education and art rather than warfare, was revolutionary to beings who had structured their entire culture around physical dominance. He told them about human history, starting with early ancestors who had survived by working together against much larger predators, how humans had learned to make tools and weapons, not because they were naturally strong, but because they were naturally clever, how they had developed agriculture and writing and music and mathematics not to conquer other species but to improve their own lives. The warriors listened with growing amazement as he described human achievements that had nothing to do with combat, the great libraries that preserved knowledge for future generations, the hospitals that healed the sick regardless of their ability to fight, the schools that taught children to think and create rather than just to destroy. Ong-Ho told them about Earth's greatest minds, scientists like Einstein and Darwin, who had unlocked secrets of the universe through observation and reasoning rather than conquest, artists like Van Gogh and Mozart, who had created beauty that lasted for centuries, musicians and writers and philosophers who had enriched human culture in ways that no warrior could match. But the Thakuri were most intrigued by his stories of ordinary humans doing extraordinary things. His wife Yunjin, who worked 16-hour days teaching mathematics to help prepare the next generation for careers in space exploration. His daughter Minha, who practiced violin for hours because she wanted to bring joy to others through music. He described his friend Tae-min, who repaired damaged space stations in the asteroid belt, risking his life every day, not for glory or conquest, but because colonists depended on those stations for survival. His neighbor Bio-Ram, who had developed new farming techniques that could feed thousands of people in the harsh environment of Mars. These stories painted a picture of humanity that completely contradicted everything the Thakuri thought they knew, a species that valued teachers as much as warriors, that honored healers and builders and artists, alongside fighters, that measured success not just in victories, but in the well-being of their families and communities. Vexstar found himself questioning fundamental assumptions about strength and weakness that had guided Thakuri culture for thousands of years. He had always believed that physical power was the ultimate measure of worth, that the strong were meant to rule over the weak, that conquest was the natural order of the universe. But humans had survived and thrived not by being the strongest, but by being the smartest. They had turned their apparent weaknesses into advantages, their small size into agility, their soft skin into dexterity, their social nature into cooperation that could accomplish things no individual could achieve alone. On the second day, Deho demonstrated more human fighting techniques for an audience of fascinated warriors. He showed them boxing and wrestling and knife fighting, explaining how each style had been developed for different situations and opponents. The Thakuri were amazed by the diversity and sophistication of human combat arts, but he also showed them things that were not about fighting at all: how to tie knots that could support massive weights, how to calculate trajectories for space navigation, how to identify edible plants and purify water, how to perform basic medical procedures that could save lives in emergencies. Practical skills impressed the warriors almost as much as the combat techniques. They began to understand that human strength came not from any single ability, but from the accumulation of thousands of small advantages built up over millions of years of evolution. Young warriors started asking if they could learn human techniques, while older fighters debated whether their traditional methods needed to be updated. Some suggested that the Thakuri had become too focused on pure physical power and had neglected other forms of strength that might be equally important. On the third morning, long-range sensors detected incoming ships broadcasting human identification codes. Vexstar immediately opened communication channels and was surprised to find himself speaking with Captain Lee Minjun of the Earth Defense Force rescue vessel Harmony. The captain was professional but firm in his demands. We understand that one of our citizens crash-landed on your world and was taken into custody. We are here to retrieve him and ensure his safety. We hope this can be resolved peacefully. Vexstar looked at Deho, who nodded encouragingly. Your citizen is safe and unharmed. He replied, he has been our honored guest and has taught us much about human capabilities. We wish to return him to you and discuss establishing formal diplomatic relations between our peoples within hours. The Harmony had landed in a cleared area outside Kethmoran's main gates. Captain Lee emerged with a small diplomatic team, looking somewhat nervous about being surrounded by thousands of 9-foot-tall alien warriors, but Vexstar had ordered his people to show respect, and the atmosphere remained peaceful. Deho felt overwhelming relief when he saw other humans again. Captain Lee looked exactly like what he was, a competent military officer who had probably seen action in the border conflicts with the Centauri pirates. His diplomatic advisor was a young woman named Park Sujin, who spoke with the confidence of someone trained in first contact protocols. We appreciate your care of our citizen, Captain Lee said formally. We understand there may have been some misunderstandings about his status, but we are grateful that no permanent harm was. Vexstar's scales shifted to colors indicating respect and slight embarrassment. The misunderstanding was entirely our fault. We did not realize the true nature of your species. We judged you by appearance rather than capability, and we have learned much from our error. As they prepared for departure, Deho found himself oddly reluctant to leave. The Thakuri were warriors, and their culture was built around concepts he could not fully accept, but they were also honorable beings who were willing to admit their mistakes and learn from them. He shook hands with Vexstar in the human fashion, which the commander attempted to reciprocate with somewhat amusing results. Remember what I told you about my wife, he said, with a tired smile. If you think I was dangerous, you shouldn't eat Yunjin when someone makes her worry about her family. The Harmony lifted off, carrying Deho back toward Earth and the family he had feared he might never see again. Behind them, the Thakuri began a complete reevaluation of humanity's place in the galaxy. They had learned that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who did not look dangerous. In the months that followed, formal diplomatic relations were established between Earth and the Thakuri Empire. Cultural exchange programs brought human teachers to warrior worlds, while Thakuri fighters learned new techniques at Earth's military academies. The galaxy became a slightly more peaceful place as two very different species learned to understand and respect each other, and in a small apartment on Mars colony, a cargo pilot named Kang Deho hugged his wife and daughter and listened to Minha play the violin song she had practiced for his return. He never told them exactly what had happened on that distant warrior world, but sometimes late at night he would remember his father's lessons about turning strength into weakness and smile at how the old man's wisdom had changed the course of galactic history. The arena on Kethmoran still stands today, but it is no longer used for blood sport. Instead, it has become a training ground where warriors from dozens of species come to learn from each other and develop new techniques that combine the best of all their traditions and carved eye.